Denise rings Brian and says, Brian,
that's so bad.
Do you think you can meet me in this state, wherever,
in another state?
And they would then spend all day together, and whenever Mike was at the conference, Brian would just be in a different hotel room.
Just a quick disclaimer, the content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, crime scenes and other disturbing material. Listener discretion is advised. This episode is sponsored by Think Forensic.
Think Forensic are a one-stop shop for all things forensic science and crime solving. They hold experience days, as well as corporate events, team building events and general education for primary school right the way up to university level, as well as other events and consultancy. There's also a shop where you can get your hands on all things crime solving, from evidence gathering to packaging and collecting evidence, as well as other forensic science equipment.
For more information or to book on an experience day, please visit the website. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 23 of the Grave Secrets podcast. We're your hosts. I'm Annie.
And I'm Beth. So today, much like last week's episode, we have another case study for you. Today's case is pretty unbelievable. It's one of those cases where you just think it would never happen to you. Not in the sense that it's kind of out of the blue and there's no, reason, but just that you would like to think that it would never happen to you.
Yeah.
It's a case of betrayal, and it's
the ultimate betrayal.
And it's absolutely unfathomable, just the way that it unfolded, the whole scenario in the first place. And I think it just reminds you that you can never tell the face of a killer, and sometimes it is the people that you love and trust the most that can betray you and be the most dangerous.
And that you least expect.
Yeah, 100%. So
we'll have everyone looking at everyone now like, oh God, could they be a killer?
So in last week's episode, we said that it doesn't matter where you are in the world, you're never safe. And on this cheery note, we're telling you that the people you love the most
could be killers.
End up being your killer.
Yeah. They do say that though, don't they? A lot of people who get murdered are known to their...
Well, the majority are, aren't
majority
they?
Are known, yeah.
Yeah.
Just to scare you even more.
In this case, we are going to be talking about the murder of Mike Williams, who was last seen on Saturday, the 16th of December in 2000. So again, early 2000s for this case. And it's a tragic case of a beloved family man who went missing whilst doing one of the things that he loved the most.
Yeah.
So again, the way that we usually do this is by talking a little bit about Mike first. So as I say, Mike Williams is the victim, and we want to give you an idea of what Mike was like as a person, who he was, before we then talk about his unfortunate murder.
So when I was researching this, I got confused at first because he's actually called Jerry Michael Williams.
Yes.
And he goes by his middle name of Michael, but then they shorten that to Mike. So Mike is who we're going to refer to all the way through this. So he was born on October the 16th, 1969, and he grew up in Bradfordville.
Yes.
So I'd never heard of this. I was like, that's really weird, because we've got somewhere near us, if you are our American listeners, we've got someone somewhere very close to us called Bradford.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, Bradfordville. Like, that sounds strange saying it like, it looks like you've just added it on to sound American.
To me, it sounded like a Toy Town version of Bradford.
Bradford,
like yeah. So again, this is an American case in this instance. So it was just north of Tallahassee, which I had heard of.
Yeah.
That Mike had grown up, and that's where he was from. Again, pretty normal family upbringing.
Seemed like quite a nice upbringing, actually, didn't it? I think his dad was a bus driver?
Bus driver, yeah. So his dad was a bus driver. His mum was like a childcare provider or a nursery nurse, from what I could gather. And they weren't wealthy, but they worked incredibly hard and taught the kids the value of hard work.
Yeah.
But it got to the point that they were working that hard, the parents of Mike, and he actually had an older brother called Nick, and the boys were actually sent to private school because the parents had worked so hard to be able to afford to put them there.
When I read about his background and his upbringing, his family, it was like obviously a very loving family environment. And I felt like his family had sort of sacrificed their own luxuries to send the boys to private school. So they'd lived in, instead of buying a house, they said they didn't want to spend all their money on putting it into a house. So they sort of lived in like a trailer caravan, didn't they?
Yeah. And I guess if they're working such long hours as well, they wouldn't be spending a lot of time in said house anyway. So all you need really is a place to...
So that's how they could actually save the money that they would have been paying on maybe like a mortgage or a house or a rent, to be able to send the kids to school. And I thought that was quite... Well, not nice, but you know, like...
Yeah, well, it's very kind of progressive because you're going to be judged for not having a house and living in a trailer, but then also it's for the good of the boys. So who's anyone to argue?
Yeah.
So again, I think some children resent the fact that they're shown hard work. It doesn't seem like neither Mike nor Nick found this.
No.
They quite enjoyed working from a young age, and Mike was really popular at secondary school. So again, he went to the private school, he was student council president.
He was doing really well, wasn't he, at school?
Yeah, he was quite good looking, he was popular, he was then also active in the football team, he was on the football team, and then as well as that, there's something called Key Club, which from what I can gather is quite a well-known scheme in America.
Right.
And it's like a youth leadership program led by students, and it's to encourage them to take up leadership positions.
Right.
And again, he was like a real keen member of it, was doing really well within...
Was that to give them like the sort of skills and the background so that when they went into a job, it was easier for them to progress maybe?
Yeah, exactly
That's actually quite a good...
Yeah, and apparently, again, Mike really enjoyed that. It was something that he loved. And at the age of 15, he then found what he really loved, which was a hobby, and it was duck hunting. Again, that's not really something that we do over here. There's quite a lot of like...
No, and was that
hunts.
like a school thing where it's like part of a school sports thing, or is this like something is done separately that your family or your father introduced you to or take you when you were younger?
Was outside of school, from what I could gather, and because of the surroundings, Bradfordville, from what I could see, has like reservoirs or bodies of water, and that is where you would do the duck hunting.
Right.
So it's probably very similar to fishing in that you've got the scenery, and you set out at an early morning, and it's just quite peaceful, and you're probably at it for a few hours.
Yeah.
And it's nice time to yourself or time out of the day.
Yeah, peaceful.
So that was his kind of key hobby, but he was also busy with obviously football, school and everything else.
And socialising as well, because he's, we've said he's a popular person.
Yeah.
He's got lots of friends within the school, but he did have his best friend who was Brian Winchester.
Yes.
And they did everything together. Like they were so close.
Yeah.
In general.
And at the age of 15, you do maybe start thinking about girls or, again, thinking about guys. And at 15, Brian and Mike then had made friends with the cheerleaders, obviously their football team, made friends with the cheerleaders.
Stereotypical.
And it's actually the first time that Mike met fellow student and cheerleader Denise Merrill, and she would then go on to become Mike's, childhood sweetheart and then wife.
Yeah.
So if we give you, again, a couple of quotes that people have used to describe Mike, there was someone called Scott Dougie, who I always look at you for pronunciations.
I know, I'm like, don't look at me, I'm worse than you for it. You're the linguist.
I know, I'm so bad at pronunciations. Who was like, again, a high school friend of Mike, and he stated, if you knew Mike, he's the kind of person that is going to do anything and everything for you. So Denise found a gem.
Right.
And the couple got married in 1994, and Mike would go home at like lunchtime, and then he'd go back to work, then come home again for tea, and then sometimes go back to work. So effectively do a full day's work and then go back afterwards.
And still go home for lunch.
Yeah. And apparently if Denise ever needed like her petrol refilling or whatever, he would drive back from work, go and take the car to the garage to fill it up.
And then go back to work again.
So all of Mike's work colleagues said they wish they were married to a Mike because he was so lovely. And another friend, Clay, said that, as we've just mentioned, he was an unbelievable worker and that he would do 15-hour long days quite commonly, and that he would then, or maybe on the next day, then go out really early morning for his duck hunting.
Yeah.
So you can imagine that if you're working such long hours, you've got a family, it's all quite intense. So sitting in front of a body of water.
Yeah, and quite peaceful.
Yeah, would be quite a nice
But it's a long
break.
day if you're doing a 15-hour shift and then you're getting up early in the morning to go duck hunting. They said sometimes you'd go duck hunting before work, and then go and do the 15-hour shift and then be home and back and home and back.
I need at least 3 naps in that day.
Yeah, I don't think I'd be making it through that day either.
So we've mentioned Brian, who was Mike's best friend, and in high school those two were pretty inseparable, but they both then married their childhood sweethearts. So Mike then got with Denise. They were together from like the age of 15, 16, and then because obviously the footballers are friends with the cheerleaders, there was another cheerleader called Kathy, and Brian actually started dating Kathy.
It's quite a nice setup because you've got like 2 friends, as in Mike and Brian, who were dating 2 friends. So it's like they did everything together, and it was like they were almost inseparable as a 4, not just like in their own 2s. They were always together.
Because clearly they already had like similar hobbies, and then they both like each other's boyfriends, girlfriends, so it's just perfect really, isn't it? And they actually got called the Rat Pack.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, because they would just, wherever one went, the other pair went. So the 2 pairs, just for clarity, because sometimes it does get confusing, we've got Mike and Denise, and then we've got Brian and Kathy, and it's those 4 that would do everything together. This remained throughout the years. So they've known each other for years and years, and they ended up getting married within the same year. They then both had their first child within the same year. So they just remained close, but in all of these different stages of life.
They went through it together still, didn't they?
Yeah. And you can just imagine that having another couple that understand what you're going through at every stage at the same time as you would just be so like encouraging and just easy, wouldn't it? Just be an easy friendship.
So when they left school, Mike actually attended Florida State University and he majored in political science and urban planning. But then while he was in college, he actually started working as well. So he was still got that good work ethic.
Yeah.
And it was a property appraising office. So I don't know if that's like our... like the people that show you around properties, or is it like an actual...
The ones that value the houses, I believe.
Right.
Yeah, so probably more office-based, but pretty intense because you're having to do a lot of calculations, I would imagine.
A lot of maths.
Yeah.
But his boss there did actually say that he was the most hardworking man that he'd come across, that he was always working, he'd do whatever it takes. And he'd actually got quite a good job, hadn't he, when he'd married Denise in 1994. And I think it was his mum that said he was earning over like $200K a year.
Yeah, he was earning an awful lot. But then again, working the hours that would mean that he earned it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Was he about our age then at this?
Yeah, I think so.
So $200K at our age.
Yeah.
It's
big time.
Decent.
Yeah. So again, as kind of a wind down, he'd go duck hunting, and Brian, I don't know whether Brian was introduced to duck hunting by Mike, but they both like thoroughly enjoyed it. So they used to go out, really often. And Mike became a kind of surrogate son also of Brian's father. So again, you mix with your best mates' families quite often, and Brian's dad was actually called Marcus, and he became a pretty prominent father figure to Mike.
They'd known each other for so long, though, hadn't they? It's like at this point, they've known each other right from being like sort of 15, well, earlier than 15.
So if you think they'll have gone to weddings, and they'll have probably been like stuff with the kids.
Yeah.
So knew each other really well. So both relationships seemed really stable within this foursome, but then obviously a lot has happened. You've got marriage, you've got kids. They're both young. They're, both couples are young, and there are obviously peaks and troughs within any relationship.
Yeah.
And I think once they had their children, the four kind of realised that they have whizzed through this period of life and achieved loads. They all, they had houses and everything like that. And they are mean feats to have achieved all that. And they'd never really let their hair down.
Yeah.
Like, yes, they'd gone to college and university, but it sounds like they were all pretty dedicated in what they were doing. And so it wasn't until kind of later in life that they started going out.
Yeah, and doing what they said they should have done back in college, and got it out of the system. So they've sort of done life a bit backwards. But I don't know if you got the same feeling as me, but from researching the case, I thought that Denise and Mike were described as having like the really nice house on the sought after area. He'd got a really good job. He did everything for his wife. I feel like Denise and Mike were maybe doing a little bit better than Kathy and Brian. Yeah.
And there was, as I've mentioned, there was trouble. There is trouble in any relationship to a certain extent. And from what we can gather, Denise was a little bit frustrated with Mike for working such long hours. Like, yeah, it's great that you've got the money, but you're not spending any time maybe, or as much time as you could be at home with the family. And I think she was getting a little bit frustrated about that.
But then again, she liked driving the nice car. She had the nice clothes, didn't she? So I think it's a bit of a catch-22, isn't it? You want to see him, but you've now got accustomed to that luxury lifestyle. Yeah.
Yeah. And he's also still being incredibly thoughtful while he's working.
Yeah.
So it's one of those where you can't kind of win, I guess. Which is probably why she valued those like nights out so much. So why the four of them were that, dead set on spending time as a foursome, having fun. So Kathy is then also said within Brian and Kathy's relationship to have had an affair at some stage. So I think they were kind of on
a little bit rocky
ground. And unfortunately, when you mix relationships and people that are going through a tough time with alcohol, it doesn't always end well. And the four would often get drunk together. And because they were so close as a foursome, one night they were at a bar and they were all discussing sex. So they were probably discussing whether or not they were having sex as much as they wanted to. Who knows what they were talking about. But apparently this is the first time that Brian looked at Mike, his best friend's wife, Denise, in a romantic way. Right. Obviously, he's known her since she was 15 and never really seen her as being... He's never fancied her. But from whatever she said in that conversation that was to do with sex, he then thought, hang on a minute, maybe I actually like her in a romantic way.
Right. It's a bit odd, though, when it's your best friend, like...
Yeah.
Your best friend's wife. Not just a partner, not just a fling, like a wife who they have children with. Do you know what I mean?
And you sat next to your own wife...
And your best friend.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a weird situation.
Very strange. But that unfortunately led to an affair between Brian and Denise, Mike's wife. So we're now going to go to October 13th, 1997. And this is supposedly the first time that the affair began.
Yeah, I thought with this, though, looking at the dates... 1997 they were having an affair, but Mike and Denise had a child in 1999.
Yeah.
So was this while the
they'd
affair
only been
was going
married
on?
2 years?
Yeah, it's I don't know if I understand, like, if she wouldn't want to draw attention to that, but wouldn't you, as Brian, wouldn't you question it, because you know what's going on? You know you've been having an affair with her.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you be thinking the whole time, like, that could be my child?
Yeah.
I know he'd obviously got a child with Kathy. But
yeah, the maths isn't mathing.
Yes, it's not.
So Brian states that obviously there was this sexual tension since that conversation that they'd had previously, but actually they'd gone to a bar in October and Mike and Kathy were actually in the front of the car. So Brian and Denise had jumped out of the car and thought, like, right, we'll go and get the drinks in at the bar and they'll just park up in the car park.
And come and meet us in there.
Yeah. Again, nothing out of the ordinary. However, they entered the bar and apparently the sexual tension was just that much that they started, in America they say making out, but started kissing.
Yeah.
And that's when it then sparked.
Right.
And apparently then it just couldn't stop because the connection was that real.
Okay.
So they'd had this kind of secret kiss at the bar. They'd then gone on to have a lovely night, the four of them. And then when they'd both returned to their respective homes, Brian had rung Denise or vice versa, and they'd stayed up on the phone talking the whole night.
How?
Yeah.
How, when you're in the house with someone? How did no one know? Unless the partners were, like, really drunk.
Yeah, I guess.
And they've just gone to bed and they've fallen asleep. Yeah.
And you wouldn't expect them to get up and then go downstairs. Or I guess maybe if someone snored, you just don't know, do you? Like, maybe it wasn't out of the ordinary.
So Brian, in general, they're obviously starting this sort of affair now.
Yeah.
But Brian's job was actually working, selling insurance, didn't I? So he worked for an insurance company. And with Mike being quite sort of wealthy and well off, he had already got some life insurance policies in place. But I think Brian was sort of Mike's advisor on things like that.
Well, he would be, wouldn't he?
If you've got a friend
and he knows finance.
Yeah. So I think he'd said, maybe you need a little bit more on your life insurance. Maybe you should make sure you're covered if anything ever happened to you, like your wife, your kid, want to make sure you're all covered. So they actually, Mike actually took out an extra policy with Brian for 1.5 million. But I thought, like, why didn't you go to Brian in the first place?
Yeah.
He'd already had these set up, but that was on top of what he'd already got set up. Yeah. So he must have been, when we say in terms of Mike was doing well, he must have been worth quite a lot.
Definitely. And at a pretty young age.
Yeah.
So we've just mentioned Brian's workplace. That, the car park of his workplace, then later became the destination that Brian would meet up with Denise. Because after that initial night, staying up talking to each other, they pretty much then just saw each other every chance they could get. They would meet up on lunch breaks, they would meet up at hotels during the day, whenever they got chance, and Mike was at work.
It almost got into, like, they were in the relationship and they stopped sort of the stuff you do with your own partners because they were that intense with each other. So both of the partners had previously said, so both Kathy and Mike had said that they'd stopped having sex. Yeah. That it was almost non-existent. But you're venting this to your best friend, saying, "Oh, we never have sex. We're never intimate anymore." But he knows full well that every single day he's being intimate with your wife. Yeah.
Horrendous. The one thing I couldn't get over, I mean, as bad as it is anyway, is that, so Mike would often go on work conferences, because again, he's very good at his job. He would go to these work conferences in other states and say to Denise, would you like to come with me? Let's have a weekend away. Let's spend time together. Because Mike is still incredibly invested in his marriage.
And Denise has already complained he doesn't spend enough time with them. Yeah. So he's obviously making the effort here, isn't he?
So Mike would take Denise to other states and then say basically, like, look, we won't have the day together because I'll be at the conference, but then we'll go out for a lovely dinner or whatever in the evening. Meanwhile, Denise rings Brian and says, Brian,
that's so bad.
Do you think you can meet me in this state,
in another state?
And they would then spend all day together, and whenever Mike was at the conference, Brian would just be in a different hotel room in the same hotel, and they would then be literally having this affair right under Mike's nose.
I feel like it's a almost like an obsession with each other.
I was going to say
because it's
that.
Not like they can leave each other alone, is it? Because
it's like it's an addiction.
I was going to say then a normal affair, but not. An affair isn't normal, but you'd think like you'd have time away with your husband or whatever and not bring your mistress or your other partner along.
You don't want to cross over.
And then you just see them when you get back. Yeah. This was almost like an obsession that they couldn't be that far away from each other.
Yeah, generally as well, isn't it? It's like they have some level of like agreement. Like, well, we don't see each other here. We don't communicate via this. You don't want to get caught out. Yeah. But they were pretty risky in terms of how they conducted this affair.
But because
and just so disrespectful. Like
it is. But I was thinking in terms of how they contact each other. If, say, Brian's name had come up on Denise's phone, it probably wouldn't have looked that weird.
Yeah, you wouldn't think anything of
friends.
It. Yeah.
So it's not like they were... You just think, what has he messaged or what's he said? But you've all been friends for over 15 years probably at this point.
There was actually an instance where, I can't believe it, Denise had actually been in the house of Brian while Kathy was in there. And Kathy was like, that sounds like Denise. And he was like, yeah, she just popped round. What? So it was obviously that out of the realm of possibility for Kathy and... Mike to believe that their other halves would do that and ruin the friendship, that they just like it literally was going on right in front of them, and none of them thought for a second that it would be a plausible option.
Yeah, it is disrespectful, isn't it?
Yeah, it's horrendous. So we then skip to December 16th in 2000. This affair has been going on now for...
a while.
A good long while. And it's at the stage now where it's Mike and Denise's 6th wedding anniversary. So again, Mike's still putting in all the effort, doing all those long hours. And he says to Denise, let's go away for the weekend.
Let's go and celebrate.
Yeah. Now, he had made a point of wanting to be... close to Denise again. So he had said that he would like them to have sex because they hadn't for a long time.
Yeah, just to feel that closeness again.
And reconnect, basically, is what Mike wanted from this trip. But, of course, he loved duck hunting. So he had said, look, we will go in the evening, but before we do that, I'm going to go out duck hunting. So went out really early morning to make sure he could have a few hours duck hunting and then be back ready for them to set off. So he left before sunrise and then, unfortunately, hadn't returned when he said he was going to.
Yeah, and he went duck hunting. This was at Lake Seminole, which I think was down on I'm sure they said, but if you're in the US, I apologise, my geography's not good. I'm sure they said it was the border, Florida and Georgia.
Okay, yeah.
I don't even know if those places are close to each other. But just from off the top of my head, and it was a massive lake. I think it was pretty much known for for duck hunting and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So again, he's not home when he's expected. They've obviously got plans, so Denise pretty quickly becomes worried about where Mike is.
Yeah.
First thing she did was ring Marcus. Now, if you remember, Marcus is Brian's father. So again, kind of honorary father figure, and he also enjoyed duck hunting. So Denise rings Marcus and says, have you heard anything? Because I certainly haven't.
And Mike had actually lost his father, and that's why Marcus became so relevant in a father figure for him. And I thought that was quite nice for your friends.
Yeah,
best
completely.
Friend to have that,
and Marcus would then feel, not obliged, but would then feel like he's going to take it seriously, and he's then going to try and find Mike for Denise. So first thing he does is ring his son, Brian, and says, Brian, have you heard? Brian says, no, I don't know where he is. So at that stage, Marcus and Brian get straight out to the lake to try and search for Mike. And as soon as they arrived, they saw Mike's truck. So initially, they kind of were a bit relieved to a certain extent.
They're like, he's here, he's ran over time, he's not looked at his watch, he's late back. Like, you just think, oh, well, at least he's here.
And equally, if something bad has happened to him, like he's fallen in the water, for example, they probably thought like they still can get to him in time. Yeah. So as soon as they know that he's still there, quite rightly, they then rang the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission. So like a local authority, but that are more specifically trained to tackle any instances or incidents within the water.
I was thinking, is that because in these places, and especially in America, they might have like the alligators and stuff.
Yeah.
So to investigate like a death by alligator is different from investigating something else, isn't it?
There's probably a lot more worry about something happening from a natural perspective, like drowning or animals or that kind of thing.
Imagine falling in there. You'd be absolutely petrified if you knew there was alligators underneath you and you'd fallen in.
Yeah, I think that put me off the whole duck
I don't think I'd get in the boat.
Place.
I wouldn't be in the boat on the lake in the first place.
So they actually arrived by 4 p.m. So again, if he set off before sunrise, we've already had a whole day now at 4 p.m. where he's still not been found.
But if you think about it, Denise, then it was just after lunchtime when she called Marcus. So she'd obviously left him enough time to come get back, and then probably a little bit extra time.
Yeah.
And then by the time they'd got to where the Lake Seminole is, we don't know how far that is from the Tallahassee, well, from Bradfordville, where they are.
I think it was at least an hour away.
Right, okay. So that explains why 4 o'clock might sound a little bit better, because if Denise has rang just after lunch, then by the time they've got to her, found out what's happened, found out where he was, find out last place he went, got there.
So when they started investigating it, pretty instantly, the commission basically got all hands on deck, because there were over 376 miles of shoreline to cover on this lake.
Yeah, and so, I feel like they seem like they know what they were doing, and they sort of sprung into action straight away with this and started a search immediately. But I suppose when it's water, you're thinking, well, someone must have fallen in, someone's drowned.
Well, this is the thing, apparently, and they did state a number, but I haven't retained it.
Yeah, I can't remember the number either.
Apparently, this was a lake which was known, unfortunately, for accidental drowning.
Yeah, so they'd know.
So they kind of obviously are worried at this stage. And yes, they found Mike's truck, but in terms of him being out on a boat, they've got over 300 miles to cover in terms of where his boat might be. So it's going to take a while.
I'm guessing you'd start, obviously, your search point would be where his truck was found and work outwards from there, sort of thing.
But then again, has he gone out into the middle of the water to then find a shoreline that he wants to moor up on?
Yeah.
Or has he gone around the edge? And if he's gone around the edge, do you start at the left or do you start at the right?
Yeah.
Or do you put half people,
Yeah.
It'd be really difficult.
And to search for, this might be a stupid question, but to search for bodies in these lakes, what do they do? Because normally over here, if we've got a lake or a river or something that needs searching, we send in divers.
Yeah.
But with the wildlife in there, could you send in divers?
Well, I'll tell you. So they search with cadaver dogs.
Yeah.
Around the edge of the shoreline. But then, luckily, they did actually find Mike's boat.
Yeah.
So when they found Mike's boat, they obviously searched the boat and found 2 life jackets in there. So again, if there's 2 already in there, is he wearing a third? Has he taken his off? Just not sure. And then a full engine of petrol. So it seemed unlikely that he'd become stranded in the middle of the water
and ran out of petrol,
and tried
so it's full.
and then got out because he's tried to swim to shore.
Yeah.
So they were, again, confused about why, if he's got a full tank of petrol, he's not with his boat.
Yep.
So then we're looking for evidence within the water to kind of bring to light what happened to him. So what they actually use is PVC poles. So we have had poles used when, again, sniffer dogs have been used, and they basically put poles down into the ground and pop for little, air bubbles, effectively, that will release the smell that the dogs then sniff. This is different poles being used. These are PVC pipes that you poke into the water, and it is effectively just meant to dislodge anything to then help
Bring
any
it up.
evidence.
Because you've got vegetation in the bottom as well, so
Yeah.
things could get stuck in the vegetation. I was just thinking, though, there's one of the girls who I did my master's with at uni, she's just graduated with her PhD now, and she actually worked on different light sources to identify bones underwater.
Oh, wow.
So I'm not exactly sure how that works, but if they'd use something maybe like that, I don't know if light-based, it'd probably have been a bit of a...
Yeah, and I guess it depends, because obviously if they started at 4, it's going to get dark pretty quickly. So I guess you have to factor all of that in as well.
And the weather you've got to take into consideration in general. I know there was during this search, it got called off pretty quick due to a storm that had happened.
Yeah,
so
it was
how
really, really
is,
cold,
is
wasn't
that?
it?
Yeah,
really cold, but it was still the second largest search, apparently, they'd ever conducted on that lake. So they were trying to work out what happened. They actually found a hat, which was found relatively nearby to the boat, but they couldn't get any. They obviously took it for testing, and they couldn't actually get any DNA from it at all. Not even Mike's DNA, which is a little bit odd. But they couldn't find anything, and so the theory was that Mike had unfortunately, for whatever reason, fallen into the water, and the reason that his body had never been recovered is because alligators had eaten his remains.
Yeah. I saw some of the theories on this, and some people were saying if the alligator had eaten Mike, that sounds horrible, there would still be some remnants or some sort of remains. They wouldn't gulp it all down. It would be separated into pieces, and then the pieces would eventually come back up to the top, but then obviously the alligator wouldn't eat absolutely every part.
But then again, the way that alligators feed, because this again has been debated, the way that alligators feed is by dragging their food to a different location and storing it, and then just feeding on it bit by bit. So that's how alligators feed. But luckily, in this case, someone just didn't quite believe that was the case.
Yeah.
And that was Mike's mother, Cheryl. So Cheryl Williams was Mike's mum, and she just couldn't quite accept this theory. One of the reasons that she didn't accept it was actually something that Mike had told her. So Mike had actually said that, don't worry about me while I'm out duck hunting, Mum, because alligators don't feed when the temperatures drop and it's really cold, and they basically go dormant.
Do they go to the bottom and then they don't feed for a while? Because is it something to do with preserving the sort of energy?
Yeah, they basically become dormant and don't feed.
I didn't know this, did you?
I didn't realise. I thought it was just hedgehogs. Yeah. So Cheryl then went to, again, an alligator expert and was like, people are telling me that the reason that we've not found him is because he's been dragged away and he's being stored there. And the expert said, no, that can't have happened.
Out the temperature on the day, didn't they?
Yeah.
And then from the temperature on the day was about 8 degrees, what the water would have been.
Yeah.
And if the alligators could have actually been active in that temperature.
Yeah.
And they couldn't, could they?
No, they wouldn't have even been at a stage where they were dragging food to store because they were just fully dormant.
Right.
So Cheryl then thinks, right, okay, I'm going to gain all of this information and just basically keep it and just keep going to the police with anything that I find. So at the same time, Cheryl is obviously trying to speak to Denise, Mike's wife, about this absolutely tragic case
Yeah.
and saying like, Denise, I just don't think, like, there's just something that's not quite right.
Yeah.
And Denise very quickly shut Cheryl down and was like, look, I know it's your son, but you just need to accept what's happened. It's a tragic accident. Get on with your life. And she actually held a memorial very quickly after
It was very
Mike's
soon.
disappearance. And people were saying, like, there's still more searching to be done. We don't need to say that he's deceased at this stage.
Yeah.
And even if he is, let's wait till it's been proven before you hold a memorial. But Denise went along with it anyway. She continued. She held a memorial, and it just seemed odd to Cheryl that she was so willing to accept the fact that it was just this tragic accident.
And so quick with everything as well. I just feel like if that was me and, you know, something had happened to my partner, I'd be the one going to the police saying, I don't think this has happened.
Yeah.
I've spoke to an alligator expert.
Are you sure?
I don't think this happened. Are you 100% on this? Like, I would be the person doing that.
My husband's mum's got
Would
all
do it
this
with you.
information. Like, can you take her seriously?
You'd be putting it together in a file for the police, ready to present to them. I'd be getting my PowerPoint presentation ready to tell them 100 reasons why they should reopen this goddamn case. Like, I just feel like she let it go way too easy.
And they've got a child together. You'd think that for the sake of the child, she'd be wanting to
at least know what's happened to tell the child.
So 6 months later, so nothing really has happened. Yes, there's been searches conducted, but they've kind of accepted this theory. 6 months later, a fisherman is then out on Lake Seminole and discovers a pair of waders in the water. So another dive is then conducted, and they then find a jacket, Mike's hunting license, and a torch. Now, this is 6 months later. We know how water works. Water generally brings things up to the surface pretty quickly after whatever has taken place. And as soon as investigators looked at these waders, the jacket, the license, the torch, they noticed that things weren't quite right.
There wasn't even any like bite marks, rip marks or anything. If the alligator theory was to be put forward again, you'd think the clothes would be damaged,
sludgy, horrible, smelly.
And the torch working.
The torch was working.
Worked.
But what is even more unfathomable is that the hunting license is literally like a piece of paper in a little wallet.
Is it like our driving license?
No, so it's not even that. It's not even plastic itself.
So it's actually
it was
paper.
in a little. It was paper.
Right.
Because again, it's a bit like having a fishing license. If you've ever seen a fishing license,
I've never been fishing. Believe it or not,
they're just like a little paper slip, effectively.
Right.
A bit like our DBS, but smaller.
Small DBS,
and not water damaged. No ink damage. Just perfectly preserved, pretty much. And they just thought, this doesn't seem right. However, Mike's body had still not turned up, and it's 6 months later, and they just thought, it's weird, but it wasn't really looked into. Again,
the waders weren't even damaged or anything though, and but I don't understand like how they thought in theory in the head that this was all fitted in with their theory.
And what has Mike done? Like, if Mike's fallen out of his boat, has he stripped off? I can kind of understand taking because apparently waders take on water. Again, I've not worn them, but they take on water quite a lot.
Right.
So you might try and unclip your waders, so that you don't get pulled into the water.
As in, if you fell in the water,
if you were like at risk of drowning. But it just seemed odd that everything turned up at once. It was all pretty intact, and would all of his clothes have just fallen off him? And equally, why aren't they damaged from alligators if we're accepting the theory that he's been
They'd be
killed
ripped, there'd be
by
bite marks,
alligator.
the driving licence would be damaged, the torch wouldn't work.
And it wouldn't appear at the same time, would it?
There's so many problems with that whole section, isn't there?
It's suspicious.
It's very suspicious.
However, kind of nothing happened from that point, other than a week later, Denise cashes in that big chunky life insurance policy for £1.75 million.
And that was because a judge actually granted Denise's petition to have Mike legally declared dead.
Yeah.
So until he was legally declared dead, she couldn't cash in the life insurance.
So ordinarily under Florida state law, which is what they fell under, you have to wait between 5 to 7 years.
I was going to say, is it about 7 years? I would have expected.
5 to 7 years before they go from I'm still a missing person to then you can declare them deceased.
Yeah.
So again, Cheryl's thinking, this is awfully odd. You were pretty quick to accept it in the first place, and then all of a sudden you've cashed in on the policy. Now, she is a single mum now. You know, does she need that money? Is it a case of she's just thinking, like, logically, like the first thing you see is some evidence that you can get the life insurance policy? Do you just go into default, or
and think,
is it
now
something,
I need to look after my family, what do I need to do next?
Like
I need
next
to sort the house out.
Or is it something more sinister? So, you know, there are certain people in this case that from that point onwards were like, yeah, there's something strange about this. So Cheryl looked into how she'd been able to cash in the policy and noticed that if you hold a memorial, then in some cases the judge will allow an exception.
Okay, so it all links together now why everything was so quick
Yeah.
and why everything was done in that order. But if you are grieving a partner, surely you're not thinking about all this.
Yeah, it's all very strange. And it'd be that horrific to think about, like your husband being mauled by alligators out doing something he loved. Yeah, you wouldn't want to think about it, would you?
No.
But Cheryl, Mike's mum, continued to gain all of this information.
She was very persistent, and she obtained so much information over years and years and years of actually just sort of looking into things herself, because the case wouldn't get opened again, or there weren't enough evidence.
Yeah.
She just kept going, didn't she?
But she actually turned around to Denise and said, like, I'm creating this file of all of this evidence for Mike. We're going to work out what's happened to Mike. And Denise actually turned around and said, you need to stop this.
Shock.
Stop this fight for justice, basically. I don't want to know what happened to Mike. I'm not interested. And if you carry on, you are not going to see your granddaughter anymore. Like, why be so brutal? Why be so awful?
Yeah.
Unless you are suspicious.
So
Cheryl then had a really tough call to make, because she was like, look, I might not be able to see my granddaughter again, but I need justice for my son.
Yeah.
So
she's got to choose between the two, really, hasn't she?
Yeah, but she kept investigating, and then eventually she sat down 3 years later with investigators and said, I've got this 27-page document about my son's disappearance and you need to look into it. So they sat down with her, and they admitted that ultimately, like, to begin with, they just thought they'd like sit down with her, say, oh, I'm really sorry, there's nothing we can do, and move on. But actually looking at it, they said, okay,
something's off, didn't they? It was almost like they didn't do the investigating and get the evidence themselves, but when they saw it in front of them, they had to do something about that, didn't they? They did say something is off.
And one of the things that was off was actually the 2 life jackets that were found in the boat.
Yep.
So because there were 2 life jackets, and Mike very, very rarely went duck hunting on his own, they said, why is there 2? Was he actually with someone else and we just don't have any information, or we haven't looked for any information about who that person is? Who is it that often goes duck hunting with Mike? Brian. So they went and spoke to Brian to see if he was present, and he claimed that he was at home and that he was actually meant to meet his father-in-law, but he'd overslept.
He'd actually made a phone call to his father-in-law from the house phone during the early-ish morning. So I think at that point police probably thought, well, that's, that places him in the house to make this phone call. It's traceable.
Yes. Then they looked further into Brian, obviously, and noted that it was Brian that, in fact, had kind of upsold Mike this further life insurance policy. And bear in mind that we're quite a few years on in this case already, they'd actually discovered that Brian and Denise had been dating since Mike's disappearance, and that they actually then went on to get married in 2005.
You know what I found really odd, though, is that when they got married, Brian then moved into the house of Denise and Mike, but technically his best friend, who had what they thought had died, he was now living in his house with his best friend's wife and child.
Yeah, and acting like
it's his
father figure to Mike's child, just completely odd. Obviously, then they spoke to Kathy, who was Brian's wife, and said to Kathy, like, what on earth is going on here? And she actually confessed at that point that on the date of the disappearance, Brian had actually left really early in the morning and then had come back later in the morning and then back again in the afternoon.
So he'd actually tried to... what had happened is the night before that Mike went missing and went duck hunting, Brian had been out with his wife and they'd had quite a lot to drink. And Kathy had actually said, we did have loads to drink. So when we got in, I was just sort of knocked out and I did sleep a bit later than usual. And I think because she'd had so much to drink, she was probably in a bit of a deeper sleep and maybe hungover. So you don't really notice as much what's going on.
Probably quite glad that he's out of the house. Gives you some peace.
Yeah.
So officers are then obviously becoming more and more suspicious of Denise and Brian. It all kind of isn't adding up, but it's very conveniently adding up for them. And they actually tried to work with Kathy to see if they could gain any insight as to what had happened. And there was actually an instance where Kathy had kind of gone undercover because Brian kept ringing her. Bear in mind, Kathy's now the ex-wife. Yeah. Brian kept ringing Kathy. And Brian asked to meet her, and so she went, and they met at like a McDonald's car park or something, and apparently he was really suspicious of her straight away and was like, I needed to meet you here, but didn't then give any information. So unfortunately, again, that was a bit of a dead end. Yeah, but they could tell that Brian was nervous and on edge and seemed really untrusting of people.
Yeah.
Now, if he has had something to do with it, you can completely understand why by this stage you're going to be.
You're getting shaken.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So right up until 2012, investigators are keeping an eye on Denise and Brian and gaining information, but really not moving forward with the case until the couple were still living in Mike's home at this stage. And this is when there is another quite serious incident.
Yeah, so they weren't really getting on, were they, by this point? And, I think there'd been quite a few maybe arguments, disagreements, and they were, I think Denise was probably thinking about leaving. I'm going to say cooling it off, but you're not cooling it off when you're married. She's thinking about divorce, isn't it, at that point?
So apparently at this stage, there was an incident with Brian and Denise arguing over the fact that he'd been using sex workers and alcohol pretty heavily.
She said he'd got like some sort of sex addiction, didn't she? And that was the reason that she'd stated in the divorce. And I think that's probably would have been quite apparent before, but she wouldn't have expected him to be using the sex workers. She would have normally been having sex with him every day, wouldn't she?
Yeah, well, this is the thing. When you're having an affair, you think, oh my God, he loves me, it's all about me. But in actual fact, maybe further down the line, she's realised that it's not her specifically, it's just a sex addiction.
Yeah.
So she had basically said that he needed to sort himself out, but that they would stay together.
Yeah.
And they'd work through things, and she was willing to do that. That was 2012, but by 2016, things had really escalated negatively.
She was fed up, wasn't she, by this point?
Yeah, and it was falling apart. So by August, Denise had said, like, I've had enough. It's clearly not going to work. We're going to get a divorce. And Brian, it seems, tipped at that stage over the edge.
Yeah, I mean, it seems strange that he's tipped at this point when surely you've seen that coming over the 3 years that you've been unhappy.
Yeah.
If she's been saying the same thing over and over for 3 years, surely you know this point is coming.
But again, if you're using sex workers and alcohol, you're probably still very much in denial.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
maybe not. And the next incident that we're about to talk about shows that he quite clearly wasn't in his right mind. Denise got in the car, ready to go to work. She gets up on her phone to call her sister while she's in the car. Next thing you know, she notices someone coming from up behind her in the back footwell of the car. And Brian, her own husband at this stage, basically jumped out at her, put a gun into her side, and she said she looked in the back and noticed that there was taupe in the back.
It's like something out of a horror film.
Yeah, and thought, right, okay, I know that I'm in danger here and he's going to do something.
This is serious.
So Brian then starts trying to direct her to go a certain way, and Denise just said that she went along with whatever Brian was saying and just tried to calm him down, because
I think that
otherwise
was the best way really to keep her safe, because she's got to think about her daughter as well in all this.
Yeah.
And you've got to do whatever you've got to do. I think all the time, what would I do if I was in these situations that I see on TV? And I've always found that the people who do comply usually are the ones that are get away the least.
But it's
unscathed.
just whether or not you'd have the capacity to be able to. Do you know what I mean? I think you've got to have some level of dissociation in a situation to be able to go
just
along
think
with
if there's
it.
a gun there, you're going to say whatever you've got to say in that situation to get
out of it.
Yeah.
So that's exactly what Denise did. She tried to talk him down. She obviously knew he was unstable anyway because of his behaviour in general leading up to that. And eventually he actually calmed down to the point where she said, I'm going to pull into this car park of, I think it was like a shop or whatever. I'm going to pull into this car park and you're going to get out of the car.
Yeah.
And he did. He got out of the car, he took his gun, and she then drove straight to the police station and basically said, I want my husband arrested. He's just tried to kidnap and attempted to kill me.
Yeah, she persuaded him, didn't she, that she wasn't going to tell anyone, she wasn't going to the police, that everything was going to be all right.
Yeah.
We could sort the marriage out. And then literally straight away, wasn't it? Straight to the police station.
Yeah. So she then, and there's interviews with her that you can actually watch, she then went straight in and said, this is what's happened. He has been, he's got a sex addiction. The marriage hasn't been great. And this is why he's then basically done what he's done.
Yeah.
Never obviously mentioned the history of how the couple met, just said that he was unstable and he needed to be arrested. So she didn't believe that it was anything more sinister than him having a meltdown about this impending divorce. But police obviously then started looking into the couple and investigating this instance. And at that stage, they said, hang on a minute, don't you think that this is maybe something to do with the disappearance of
your ex-husband?
Yeah, of Mike. If Brian's willing to kill you when you're his wife, do you not think that he was somehow responsible for Mike's death? And she was just categoric in saying, no, he had nothing to do with it. I don't believe that what's happened today has any bearing on what happened previously.
Right.
I don't think he has any involvement in Mike's disappearance.
Yeah, and for her to be going straight to the police with something like that, but then defending so hard on something else.
That's what sent really odd. Because
when they're both the same situation, really. If they both got a gun and trying to kill someone.
Obviously, when you marry someone, you trust them.
Yeah.
So you'd think if all of a sudden you can't trust your own husband because he was about to kill you, you would question everything else.
Yeah.
You would question whether or not he'd been involved in Mike's death.
And you'd want to help. And at this point, you'd probably go back to Mike's mum and be like,
God, Cheryl,
I'm
you were
so
right
sorry.
all along.
You were right. Yeah, I am sorry. Wouldn't you do something?
Yeah, you'd think. So investigators now have finally got a bit of an in terms of trying to uncover what's actually happened to Mike.
So this sort of like, this incident that's happened has brought all the attention back onto them too, hasn't it? So it sort of backfired really on what she wanted to gain from it.
Well, this is where the unravelling occurs, isn't it? This is where it all backfires for them. So Brian was in fact arrested and charged with kidnapping and aggravated assault. And what was really clever, I think, of the police is they actually were charging him and looking at sentencing him to life.
Yeah.
Which, yes, obviously kidnapping is a serious offence, but generally you wouldn't get a whole life sentence for it. But in this case, they'd
sort of calculated this out, hadn't they?
Yeah, they were going hard on Brian because they left him in prison for 16 months, and at that point in October 2017 he was offered a deal. They basically said, look, you have got a real horrific time ahead of you. You're going to be in prison for life. We can help you out here if we give you full immunity for another charge, which would be the murder. Of Brian. The murder of Mike, sorry. We will basically not add a second life sentence to what you're already about to be serving.
Yeah, it would work out he would be doing like 20 years in prison for the kidnapping, which obviously is a lot, but life in America is not like life here, like we've said before. Life is a lot longer. So that probably sounded like quite a good deal to Brian, and he thought there is probably a chance that I will get out of here alive and not die in prison.
And full immunity is not a deal that they usually offer out. You know, it might be a lesser sentence, but this was full immunity. So in 2017, 16 years after Mike's initial disappearance, Brian confessed to Mike's murder, the murder of his best friend. And Brian said that Mike's body had actually been buried on the edge of the water at Carr Lake, which was in Leon country, which was 5 miles from where Mike had actually grown up.
Right.
So it was there that obviously investigators went straight out to try and identify Mike's body, find Mike's body, and they did in fact find him buried in the same clothing that he had gone missing in, and that was on the 18th, 2017.
I watched some of the videos from the trial of Brian doing the confession, and I thought it was all pretty shocking, really, because he was saying stuff, but it was so matter of fact. So he said, like, we went out onto the lake, I found like a spot, and he was describing how the boat was flat on the back, and then, you know, how he could do what he did, how he could push him in, and that he actually pushed Mike into the water, but then pulled him back up onto the boat, didn't he? That in itself is surely quite a hard job to do.
Yeah. It's really horrific, isn't it? Because, again, it seems like a bit of dissociation, because he did just talk about it so matter of fact.
Yeah.
But he said it was all going wrong kind of from the off. There was quite a lot. I mean, we could, again, if you watch any of the... of Brian on the stand, he goes into exceptional detail. He does, doesn't he? Yeah. But it was all kind of going wrong from the off, and he didn't really know what to do. So like you said, he effectively told Mike to stand up and then sped up the boat so that Mike fell off the back of the boat, but then described that Mike obviously knew that he could potentially drown, and so was scared. And Brian said that then freaked him out. He didn't know what to do about it. He'd hit him over the head, but that hadn't worked. Mike was then trying to undo his waders because he was aware that would help, but then looked confused because he couldn't work out why Brian wasn't coming close with the boat. It's absolutely horrific. So considering the length of sentence that Brian was expected to get, everyone was quite confused when he was then only convicted and charged with 20 years.
Right.
But what nobody knew is that that's because he'd struck this deal. So 5 months after Mike's body was finally recovered from the deposition site that Brian had buried him at, Denise was finally arrested and charged. So it was 5 months after October the 18th, and she was then arrested and charged with first-degree murder,
Right.
conspiracy to commit murder,
Okay.
and accessory after the fact. So pretty heavy charges.
Yeah. So do you think that she was there any proof that she was aware of this the whole way through? That she knew that this was going to happen? It was a setup, or?
No, and I think due to her actions next, she was pretty convinced that they didn't really have a lot on her, kind of a lot to prove it, because she actually pled not guilty.
Right.
So she obviously didn't think that there was evidence stacked
Enough
up
to
against
charge,
her.
yeah.
So she probably didn't realise that Brian had given the testimony to the extent that he had.
Yeah, because Brian had actually testified against her, didn't he?
Yeah.
In trial, which ultimately is the main piece of evidence that they've got.
And although she knew that Brian had talked about her, she just thought it would be his word against hers, and that wouldn't actually be enough to prove.
And I suppose with his background and his kidnapping charges, it's more likely that she probably thought the police would believe her over him.
Yeah. And she does seem quite good at playing the victim, to a certain extent.
Yeah.
So in December 2018, almost 18 years after Mike had initially been reported missing, since the day of Mike's murder, Denise was then on trial, and Brian's testimony was the only thing that actually linked her to her husband's murder. So again, Denise thought pretty much she was going to get away with it. During the testimony of Brian, as we mentioned earlier, he went into such excruciating detail about everything.
Yeah.
And again, he was questioned about each point, but he remembered everything like you would, really.
All these years later,
All these years later, and that basically, in terms of motive, stated that Denise just would not get a divorce. He said he thought quite a lot of it was pride. She didn't want to be seen to be getting a divorce. Again, whether or not it was like religious upbringing and it wasn't the thing to do to get a divorce.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, divorce just didn't seem like an option. So Brian said that Denise was coming up with other ways in which they could effectively live happily ever after.
And in which ways she could keep her lifestyle, keep the house, keep the child, keep the money.
Yeah. So Brian and Denise had actually come up with multiple ideas in terms of how best to kill Mike. And one of their ideas actually involved also killing Kathy.
Wow.
Which thankfully they didn't go through with. But they'd come up with all kinds of things. And again, if you watch any of his testimony, he goes through them in detail. But one of them was to stage a break-in, which again we've seen in numerous cases before. But they ended up settling with the boat trip. One, because apparently there would be some element of it where it would be left to chance. So what actually happened, we'll talk about in a minute, but they were under the impression that he could kind of just push Mike off and Mike would drown, and then it would be left up to God as to what would happen to Mike.
The hell?
And apparently that seemed more comfortable for Denise. So she didn't mind that.
Wow.
And why did it happen when it did? I hear you ask, Annie. Well, they decided that the life insurance policy that Brian had actually taken out for Mike was actually set to expire.
Okay.
And they'd spoken about it, Brian and Mike had said he didn't think he was going to renew the policy.
Okay.
So obviously money motive.
So it's now or never, basically, weren't it?
Yeah. So the motivation was there from a money perspective. And then also, due to it being the anniversary weekend away, nor Denise or Brian wanted Mike to have sex with Denise, because obviously that would make Brian jealous, and Denise didn't actually want to have sex with her husband. So they decided that if they killed him before the trip,
she wouldn't have to have sex.
She wouldn't have to have sex.
Okay.
And you think, okay, well then that's obviously a reason to murder someone. So again, because Brian gave such detail, unfortunately for Denise, he was offered or given immunity, and it was pretty irrefutable that she had been a big part of the planning to kill her own husband. So she was actually sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus 30 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
30. Plus another 30 on top of that, as if life ain't enough in America.
Yeah. So that was in 2018. But then actually in 2019, that conviction was overturned. It all seems quite messy. I was trying to find more information about like the new ruling and the retrial and stuff, but I couldn't find an awful lot.
Is it because any new laws have come in, or is it just because she's appealed, or is it because...
She definitely appealed it.
Yeah.
She appealed the initial conviction, but then it was... So in 2020, the appeals court overturned the murder conviction and the life sentence.
Right.
But then she was later re-sentenced to 30 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder.
Okay.
So it went from overturning the murder conviction, but then she got the same charge anyway for conspiracy.
But then she didn't get the life plus the 30. She just got the 30 this time.
As
so
far
there's a
as
chance that she might be able to get out.
Yeah.
Whereas before, life plus 30, you're not getting out, are you?
No.
At all.
But it all sounded very confusing. And I'm not sure what got it overturned. Again, I couldn't find too much information about that.
I just think when like the whole story as it sort of unravelled, when Brian was telling his story in court, like it was very premeditated, because on the morning that Mike had gone missing, Brian had actually gone out obviously on the duck hunt with him.
Yeah.
But when they met up that day, they actually met in a car park. And Brian said, I've got no signal. No, I've got no battery on my phone. So just follow me here. Just follow me to this new place where we're going to go hunting. And he obviously knew that there was going to be no trace of his phone, because I don't think it was anything to do with the battery. He just turned it off.
Yeah, he specifically didn't want them to be able to trace his phone at that location, did he?
Very premeditated, if you ask me, on Brian 100%. And obviously Denise's part.
But then again, considering how much they'd obviously discussed at length what they were going to do and how it was going to play out, it very quickly seemed like Brian lost control over the actual situation. Again, when we were talking about it, I said that when Mike was struggling in the water, Brian just panicked and didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
So he actually panicked, had his gun with him at the time, took out his gun and shot Mike while Mike was in the water, but said that he shut his eyes when he shot Mike.
Right.
Because he couldn't face looking at his best friend.
But he could still face shooting him.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then, like we mentioned, horrifically, and I can't even imagine this, he then had to pull out Mike's body, pulled him back onto the boat. And then what's absolutely unbelievable is that he decided that because all of his timings had gone awry, again, he thought basically he could go out on the boat with Mike, kill Mike all really quickly and have it all sorted and tidied up in time to meet his father-in-law for their trip out. Unfortunately, this obviously didn't go to Brian's timing schedule. And what he ended up having to do is take Mike's body in the back of his truck, Brian's truck, back home, and then got back into bed with his wife, Kathy.
Knowing that his best friend is in the truck outside.
And then used the alibi of oversleeping.
Yeah, but another thing that was really horrible, when Brian said, I got up and looked out of the window, my drive is on quite a bit of a slant, and he could see blood dripping out of the back of his truck onto his driveway. So he panicked, went back out, started hosing the driveway down, and then that's when he actually left again with the body in the car.
Yeah.
He spoke to people where he went to dump the body.
I was just
he
about
had a
to
conversation with someone
he knew, he bumped into, and apparently that person afterwards had said like, you seemed really like on edge and upset. And obviously that person had heard about Mike going missing, so had just assumed that Brian was devastated because his best friend was missing, when in actual fact he said, well, I was trying to get rid of Mike's body at that point.
And the body was in the car while they were talking, weren't it, in the back of the truck?
So he then ended up having to go again to the shop and buy sheets to wrap Mike's body in before he then decided to bury him where he did. And apparently he decided on that location because the water was low at the time.
Yeah.
So it meant that he could bury Mike's body, and then as the water level became higher, he thought that it'd be buried there forever. Again, you know, whether or not Mike's body would have, if there was water there, whether or not at some point it would have resurfaced.
Yeah.
But by that stage, it would have been that badly decomposed that it probably wouldn't have given them, other than, you know, comfort for Cheryl to have her son back, it probably wouldn't have given them much else.
No.
So that is the case. Obviously, Brian got away with murder.
Yeah.
Because he was serving a sentence for the kidnapping of Denise, but he was completely immune from any charges in relation to Mike's murder.
Yeah.
And that's been obviously very difficult for the family and friends of Mike to deal with. But it does mean that they, unfortunately, know what happened to Mike, and that they can at least, you know, have some comfort in the truth of the
all
situation.
Those years as well.
Yeah.
Just think for his mom, like all those years she'd not known what had happened.
Yeah, but she was fighting because she knew that something wasn't right.
Yeah.
And then
it
she
wasn't.
was proved.
Mother's instinct, isn't it, on that one?
So another case for you there. We will be back next week. Please let us know in the comments what you thought, whether or not you saw this one coming, how you feel about the fact that Brian didn't actually, you know, suffer any consequence for this
there was
case.
no justice, was there, really, for the family, especially for Cheryl.
And the amount of culpability that you think Denise had in this. Do you think that Brian would have killed Mike for Denise, or do you think that he only went through with it because Denise was that adamant that it needed to happen? All lots to ponder, I guess.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for listening or watching. If you have enjoyed the episode, please leave us a review. It'd be greatly appreciated. And in the meantime, take care.
Bye.